Hello Raptors fans, and welcome back to Raptors Report. Oh geez, another quiet trade deadline. Psych! The Toronto Raptors traded for Brandon Ingram. Wow, huge deal for the Raptors, one of the biggest deals of the trade deadline, and something with a lot of moving parts, a lot of things to unpack, fit, tons of stuff to discuss about Brandon Ingram and the Toronto Raptors. So what we're going to do today is usually we talk about something pertinent to do with the Raptors, and then we talk about the game that happened. And there was a game yesterday. It was the Memphis Grizzlies against the Raptors. That was, you know what, I don't even want to talk about that game. So this is actually pretty good timing. We're going to skip the game today and just focus on this trade because it is a very big trade for the future of the Toronto Raptors, and I want to get into it. So let's start off by looking at the trade itself. The trade was the Toronto Raptors sending out Kelly Olynyk, Bruce Brown, Indiana's 2026 first-round pick, and the Toronto Raptors 2031 second-round pick. So there was a little bit of confusion about what picks were involved. Those are the picks that are involved, and frankly, I am not too torn up about the 2026 Indiana first-round pick. I think that obviously the New Orleans Pelicans had to be compensated in order to make this deal, and I am okay with that pick being used. If it was this year's pick, it would be a different story. So what's the idea behind this trade? Well, from a 10,000-foot view, this is the Toronto Raptors trying to buy low on a star player in his prime. That would be my elevator pitch for why this trade happened. Now, there are some complicating factors, but sending out two role players, one on the final year of his deal, a late first in next year's draft, probably a late first, the Pacers should probably be pretty good next season, and a distant second-round pick for a star forward on paper is a good trade for the Toronto Raptors. So just in a vacuum, without looking at any of the other factors. But there are complicating factors with this trade that need to be discussed. Injury history with Brandon Ingram. I detailed this the last time I spoke about this potential trade. There is a contract situation that we will get into, and then there's the issue of fit. And I want to discuss all of those things along with, what Ingram brings to the table. But first, let's talk about the injury history. And in my mind, this is the biggest complicating factor with the trade. Brandon Ingram has a long list of injuries within his career. He has been injured many times. Lots of different types of injuries. There have been a couple of recurring things. He has had hyperextensions of his knee. He has had other ankle injuries. But I would say generally he's missed a lot of games. But this is more of injuries that have been spread out amongst a bunch of different things, rather than one repeated injury to one part of the body, like a major recurring problem about a knee or one of his ankles, that kind of thing. There are some legit concerns here, but the damage is kind of being spread out over his body rather than being concentrated into a certain area. So I think that's a slightly good sign here. This is not a case where a guy's knees are just completely broken and the Raptors are buying damaged goods. I think that the Toronto Raptors here are making a calculated gamble that these injury concerns are not as major as his missed games would have you believe, because he does hover around 60 games played per season, and he has had major injuries throughout his career that have prevented him from playing a lot of games. So that is a major concern, and that is what I would say is the number one concern that I have with this deal. Next up, let's talk about his contract. It's kind of complicated because the Toronto Raptors are trading for a player who is going to become a free agent, and they have done this in the past, and this is a concerning thing. But there are a couple of mitigating factors that make it not as dangerous as you may assume. So first of all, the Toronto Raptors gave up a first-round pick in this deal. So if he were to walk in the offseason, this would kind of be a catastrophe because they gave up a real concrete bargaining chip for a player who never joined the team, really. What I would say is that I think that the Toronto Raptors have spoken with Brandon Ingram's camp, and he has expressed interest in joining the Toronto Raptors long-term. And from what I've heard is that Ingram is excited to come to Toronto. He's excited to be out of New Orleans. And if you've heard, there are a couple of clips going around that Toronto is one of Brandon Ingram's favorite cities in the NBA. When he was listing the cities that he likes to visit, he mentioned a couple of other cities and then Toronto out of 3. So that's a good sign. I would say that this is not a situation where the Toronto Raptors are getting a guy like maybe Kawhi Leonard, who has his eye set on another place and is not going to be here long term. I think that if the price is right, Brandon Ingram will commit with the Toronto Raptors. Now let's talk about the Raptors cap situation, because yesterday when it was floated that the deal was going to be Bruce Brown and Chris Boucher for Brandon Ingram, this would put the Toronto Raptors into the tax. And they would have, if they were to pay him what he wants, they would be pretty much hard capped into the luxury tax. However, because they are sending out Kelly Olynyk, who has a year remaining on his deal, that means that you can kind of wipe $12 million off of the books when you're considering what the Toronto Raptors have on their cap for next season, which is good. The Toronto Raptors will have about $48 million under the first apron based on the players that they have on the team currently. If the Toronto Raptors end up with a top 5 pick in this year's draft, that value will shrink by around $8 to $12 million. So you do the math, they'll have around $40 million to play with. And I don't think that that's a bad place to be with Brandon Ingram, because that is kind of around where Brandon Ingram is going to sign for. They still might be able to make some extra room by trading, say, Emmanuel Quickley or RJ Barrett at the trade deadline, because I'm not sure what's going to happen with those two. But if they remain on the team, the Toronto Raptors should have enough money to make things work. Now let's talk about what Brandon Ingram could stand to make as a player. So because Brandon Ingram has 9 years of experience in the NBA, he is not eligible for the 10-plus year max, which is quite a lot. If he signs with the Toronto Raptors, which are considered his own team, he can make $45 million next season, followed by yearly bumps of about 8% every year. Now, if the Toronto Raptors were to sign him to the full 5-year max, he would make $60 million in his final season. I don't think that the Toronto Raptors should offer him that contract. I think that the Toronto Raptors should look to give him what he wants in the short term, something like a 3-year deal or a 4-year deal with a club option. And I think that that is potentially something that he would be interested in doing. And the reason for that is because of his injury history. If you commit 5 years to a player with a significant injury history, you could be on the hook for a long time. A very big contract could be sitting on your books, and you would be essentially dead in the water over that period of time. It would be a disaster. Of course, if everything works out, you would want to have him signed to 5 years, which is why a club option would be good, but I'm not sure if that is, realistic. The Toronto Raptors have not had many players sign club options in the past. They're more of a team that gives out player options, but we'll see. I don't think that they should give him a very long-term deal. A 3-year deal would be something that I'd be looking to get him to sign. One of the things that benefits the Raptors here is that there are not many teams that have cap space this offseason. There are a lot of teams that are over the cap, and also teams that are close enough to the cap that they would not be able to offer a large enough contract to Brandon Ingram in order to pull him away from the Toronto Raptors. So that's something that's working in their favor. And if that is working in their favor, I would hope that the Toronto Raptors could sign him below a max contract. And because he's had injury issues in the past, perhaps that's possible. But I don't really know. I'm more concerned about the length of the contract rather than, say, the dollar value in year one. But that's kind of what you're looking at right now. Let's talk fit, because this is a pretty contentious issue. This is something that I've seen people have an issue with within Raptors fandom. How is Brandon Ingram going to fit into the team? This is the factor that I have the least amount of concern in. I think that fit is very important in the final stages of a compete. You want to make sure that the team that you have makes sense in terms of fitting together, because synergy is extremely important when you're looking to win a championship. The Toronto Raptors right now are in the asset acquisition phase of the rebuild. They are trying to get as much talent, by hook or by crook, through the draft, free agency, trades. They are trying to bring in as much talent as possible. This is not the phase where everything has to line up perfectly in order for you to compete. If you look at it from that perspective, fit is not as important as I think people are making it out to be. The Toronto Raptors need talent. And Brandon Ingram, if he is healthy, is probably the most talented offensive player on the Toronto Raptors. So when you talk fit, most of the time, if you brought prime LeBron onto your team, you're not going to say, oh, well, how is he going to fit with Emmanuel Quickley or RJ Barrett? I mean, you could talk about fit with Scotty Barnes, but all of the other pieces on the team, you're going to be looking to find guys to fit with him. And while Brandon Ingram is not at that caliber, he is still extremely talented on the offensive end. He is a tall, legit number one scoring option who's a good playmaker and a 3-level scorer. He can shoot the 3, he can shoot the mid-range, he can get to the basket, he can create his own shot. He is a special offensive player who is very good at what he does. That is the type of player that you want to find a fit around, not necessarily try and fit him into what you already have. So keep that in mind. As I said, I think that the fit with Scotty Barnes is important because Scotty Barnes is probably the most important player on the Toronto Raptors right now. He has a very big ceiling. He has strengths and weaknesses as a player that you want to kind of find players that will be able to fit with him. And while I think that there are some concerns about what Brandon Ingram does and what Scotty does and whether there's overlap there, for example, I've seen people say that Brandon Ingram and Scotty Barnes are both mid-range players, which you kind of want to limit in the modern NBA. But both players are very unselfish. Brandon Ingram can shoot the 3, even though he is not probably shooting enough of them right now. And you can move other pieces around in order to make that fit more harmonious. And another thing is, people talk about Scotty Barnes's work in the mid-range. He has that nice mid-range shot now. In my opinion, the mid-range shot that Scotty Barnes uses right now is a result of him not having elite space within the offense. He is the primary focal point of the other team's defensive strategy. They are working to try and keep him out of the paint. And one of the things that is almost always available to players in the half court is a mid-range shot, which is why I think that it's positive that he's developed that, because right now he can't get all the way to the basket. Brandon Ingram, being that number one caliber offensive player and playmaker, is going to draw defensive attention away from Scotty Barnes so that he won't be as reliant on his mid-range shot in order to score. At least that's how I see it. Those two players are unselfish, they have a lot of talent, and I think that they could make it work, just between the two of those. The other pieces around them, if things aren't going very well, you can try and make a trade to make those pieces fit a little bit better. That's how I see things. So let me just give you a grade. I'll explain the reasoning here. If the Toronto Raptors traded a late first-round pick, a distant second-round pick, and 2 role players for a healthy, under contract Brandon Ingram, this trade is a slam dunk, A+, highway robbery. What are the Pelicans thinking? So if you put it into that context, this trade is an A+. However, there are complicating factors. Injury history, contract, and to a certain extent fit, although I think that's less important. So I'm going to give the trade, I think that bumps it down significantly to a B-. And this is, there is a huge amount of variance here. This is a feast or famine type of trade, because if Brandon Ingram can stay healthy for the length of his contract, relatively healthy, like I'm talking around, 60 to 70 games played every season, I think that this is a great trade. I think, and is healthy for the playoffs, I think that they cooked here and they did a good job. If he's injured, if he can't play in the playoffs, if he's a walking Band-Aid, or if for whatever reason the contract situation is way more complicated than it looks right now, then it's a disaster. It's like an F. So that's what I think right now. I'll tentatively give this a B- grade. Now let's talk about Brandon Ingram and who he is as a player. Who is he? What are his strengths? How is he going to fit into the offense? So let's talk about it. First of all, Brandon Ingram likes to handle the ball. His most used play on offense is as the pick and roll ball handler. He likes to use screens while handling the ball. And not only is he a good scorer in the pick and roll, he's also a good distributor in the pick and roll. That is where he makes a lot of his plays. He can get into the paint, and if there's too much defensive attention, he can kick it out. He can find the roll man, all of that good stuff. He is a good pick and roll ball handler. So how is that going to fit with the team? So I think they're probably going to keep Jakob Poeltl, and Jakob Poeltl is a very good screen setter. He's very good at creating space for the ball handler on the drives. He's very good at using Gortat screens if they want to get all the way to the basket. So that's one thing that he likes to do, is pull up in the mid-range when a screen is set for him, but there will be other opportunities for him to get all the way to the rim with Jakob Poeltl as the screener. He's very good at screening. I think that they could develop a good synergy there. Second of all, Scotty Barnes has been screening more now that Emmanuel Quickley is back, now that it looks like he's kind of trying to discover his role in the offense. I think that he's taken a step back from being only the ball handler in the pick and roll. He's now setting more screens at the top of the arc and being more of a roll man and short roll passer, that kind of thing. So if he can have synergy with the players currently in the roster, I don't see why he couldn't with Brandon Ingram if he's the one setting the screen. I think that could be a fruitful play between the two of them. And despite Brandon Ingram's reputation of being a guy who is an on-ball player and not playing off of the ball very much, spot-up shooting is his second most used play type. And last season, he used about 17% of his possessions as a spot-up shooter. And one of the things about the Pelicans is that they are looking for a player who is going to generate offense. So he was kind of the creator in that lineup. But because the Toronto Raptors have a lot of those different types of players, I think that there is potential for him as an off-ball player. And I don't expect him to completely shift. I think that he will have a lot of on-ball responsibilities, but he was a good spot-up shooter. He used 17% of his possessions there and was in the 62nd percentile. So he was pretty good in that play. And in other seasons past, as a spot-up shooter, he was like close to 90% in that play type. In addition to that, he comes off of screens about 7% of the time, and he's a very good play finisher there as well. He's in the 84th percentile, good points per possession. He is a player that can play on the ball and likes to play on the ball, but I think that there is potential for him to be an off-ball player as well. I think that there's some scalability there. I think he can be used in that role. And I think that the Toronto Raptors can afford to give him on-ball responsibilities as well. I don't think it's like he's going to be forced to play off of the ball the entire time. I think that he is a good option for the Toronto Raptors to run pick and rolls with. And let's zoom out here. Let's zoom out because we're very narrow focused right now. Brandon Ingram, if he is healthy and in good shape, is a really good offensive player. He is efficient. He can handle the ball. He can shoot. He can create his own shot, and he is a good playmaker at 6'8", and he is in his prime. These kinds of players don't grow on trees. They're not available for trade most of the time. There have to be some pretty extenuating circumstances, which there are here, for you to be able to pick up one of these players in their prime. So I think that he is worth molding your team around, creating an identity with, if he is healthy. So that's kind of a contradiction there, but he is good enough as a player. That is not what I'm worried about. Defensively, Brandon Ingram started off his career kind of with a very poor defensive reputation. He was too thin. He didn't really know what he was doing. He had a rep of being a poor defender. He's improved there. There are still some issues. So he has good foot speed for a tall player. He's very long and can contest shots. He can help out a little bit around the rim. You can even play him kind of as a small ball big in stints, kind of Kevin Durant style. But he does have engagement issues on the defensive end. So RJ Barrett kind of similar there when he's not locked in. If he's ball watching, there can be some issues there. He has to provide a little bit more in terms of locking in on that end. So I'm not going to sit here and say he's a great defender. I will say that he was a very poor defender and has become a pretty good defender when he's healthy. And in terms of his rebounding, he is good for a wing. If he is playing as a wing, he is a very good rebounder. If you're playing him as a big, you're going to be giving up a lot on the boards. But I think that he is a good enough rebounder, and the Toronto Raptors have Scotty Barnes, they have Jakob Poeltl, they're going to be doing a lot of the rebounding. So as a wing, he's going to help out on the boards. He's very tall. He can take advantage of box outs. He can take advantage of his height in the paint and help out there. So there's another thing that I want to address here, which is the time frame, the context of the deal. I saw there have been, I'm not going to tell you who it is, but there have been people online who have been saying, well, they're missing out on a generational talent, kind of like what happened with Jakob Poeltl. This is not like that. Jakob Poeltl was a misstep by the front office, and the reason was they did a win-now move at the trade deadline for a team that didn't look like it was worth it, and then they missed out on Wembanyama because they didn't lose enough games in the final bit. This isn't like that. Brandon Ingram is currently injured. There is no time frame for his return, both with the Pelicans and, as far as I know, with the Toronto Raptors. The Toronto Raptors can slow play Brandon Ingram's injury, allow him to fully recuperate, and not have to play major minutes this season. They can simply let him rest and collect the losses. This is not like where Pirtle added a bunch of wins to a team that looked like it should be moving in the opposite direction. So I want to get out in front of that. I don't think that's a valid concern. In fact, this is probably going to help the Toronto Raptors get a generational talent because they sent out 2 good veteran players, Kelly Olynyk and Bruce Brown, 2 guys that were contributing to wins, especially in that 10-game stretch where they won 8 of 10. Those guys played a big part in that winning portion of the season. Trading those players away for a player who is currently injured is not going to make the team better. Let's think about this. So they will still have the potential of drafting highly in this year's draft. And if they finish in the bottom 5, they will have a good chance at Ace Bailey, at Dylan Harper, at a guy like Cooper Flagg. They will be in the running for that. It's far less deterministic now. If you're in the bottom 5, you got a shot. Even the team with the worst record only has a 14% chance of getting the number 1 pick. It's pretty flat at the top. So the Toronto Raptors are going to probably be bad enough to be in that area, depending on how they finish the season and, how many injuries they have, how many players remain on the team after the trade deadline, etc. So don't worry about that. With that said, this is still a very risky trade. The Toronto Raptors have traded real value, a first-round pick, for a player who is owed a big payday, and they will have to pay that player and keep him on the books. And if that player remains injured and is unreliable, this will look terrible. They'll be the laughingstock of the league. If that player gets to play every season around 70-ish, 60 to 70 games, they can even load manage him kind of similarly to what they did with Kawhi Leonard. I know that is a huge, red button in the current NBA, but I think that they have confidence that they can maintain a player who has injury concerns. If they can do that, this is a huge home run. This is a big, big deal. They have just added a player who is a very good offensive player, very good, and plays at a position where those kinds of players do not grow on trees. Forwards with the ability to score and play make are not common. So those are my thoughts on the deal. Of course, there could be more deals coming up when this video is released, but B-, there's some issues there. There are some things that people are hyping up that I don't think are big problems. So those are my thoughts. And yeah, that's the video. Please let me know, what do you think about the Brandon Ingram trade? Does what I'm saying make sense to you? Are you hesitant about the deal? Am I overstating how risky it is? Let me know here in the comments and also on Twitter and Blue Sky, where you can reach me at Raps Report. Love talking to Raptors fans. I really want to hear your thoughts on this deal, so please let me know. And if you haven't already, please leave a like and subscribe, because that really helps the channel grow, helps this content reach other Raptors fans like you. And as always, thank you for tuning in to Raptors Report, your source for in-depth Raptors content.